Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on adding our new options scene, and we started adding in our logic for allowing a player to interact with the scene and to update our settings that'll be available in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links to the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up. So let's get started. Alright, so previously we worked on adding in our input logic, and we tied this to our options menu to allow our player to select which game options they like to set for their game. And one of the options that we started to set up was our menu color, and so right now we can allow the player to choose an option, but it doesn't do anything. And currently in our code, in our update menu color display text method, we have some to-dos for adding in our logic. And so for our logic, what we want to do is when we change this menu color setting, we want to go ahead and modify our background image, our texture that's being used for our containers here. And so, as an example, when I change this to a 2, this would change from this blue color here to another color that we set up, purple, green, etc. And when we do this, we're going to go ahead and save that texture setting that we select, and then that way later on in our world scene, when we open up our menus, we can also use that same color there. And so to do this, because our background images here are using our custom 9-slice implementation, what we need to do is we need to modify this class to allow us to provide multiple assets. That way, we can go ahead and create 9-slice images from each of those textures. And then we need to go ahead and add a new method, a public method, that we can call, which will allow us to then modify the texture of each of the 9 game objects that we originally created in our create 9-slice container method here. Alright, so to go ahead and get started with our changes, the first thing we'll do is let's jump over to our preload scene. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add in a couple assets that we want to use for our menu here. And so let's jump over to our asset keys really quick. And let's go ahead and come up to our UI asset keys object. So we have our main menu background that we've already added, and that's how we're creating our 9-slice image here. And we're going to go ahead and add in 2 new ones. And so we're going to call this menu background green. And then we're going to go ahead and call this menu background purple. And we'll go ahead and update our values of our object. And so for these assets, basically what these are going to be custom images that have a few different colors. So currently in our images, Kenny's asset UI space expansion folder, you should have 2 assets, one of them for this glass panel green, this glass panel purple. And so these are similar to the original glass panel, but they have some tinting to change the color. And so then what we need to do is back in our preload scene, we're going to go ahead and load in those assets. So if we can come up to where we create our UI assets, let's copy this line of code here, where we create our glass panel. We're going to paste it twice, and let's go ahead and change our asset keys. And so let's go ahead and do purple first. So we'll have our menu background purple, and then for our name, this is going to be glass panel underscore purple. And then for green, similar, we'll go ahead and do our green for our asset key, and this will be glass panel underscore green. All right, we'll go ahead and save, and we'll go ahead and close those 2 files. And then what we'll do is let's come back to our 9-slice class. Alright, so what we're going to want to do is for our configuration, currently we just expect an asset key, so just 1 string, and we use that for creating our 9-slice textures. And we also store a reference to that. And instead, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to change this to expect an array of strings. And then that way, for all of our strings that we pass in, we'll go ahead and create our 9-slice textures. And then that way later, when we want to go ahead and change the texture that's applied to our current 9-slice containers, we can go ahead and pass in that string, and we'll be able to do that. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and get rid of our asset key property, and then we'll go ahead and get rid of our reference here, and then we're going to change this to be config our asset keys, and then for each asset key, we are going to want to go ahead and call our method, and so let's just copy this, paste it in here, and we're going to change this to just asset key from our loop. And then real quick, let's jump over to our options scene. And when we create an instance of our 9-slice container, let's go ahead and change this to asset keys. We'll change this to an array, and then we'll come back to our class. All right, so the next thing we need to do is let's come down to our create 9-slice container method. And so previously we were referencing asset key from our class, but because now we're passing that array, we're going to need the calling code to provide the asset key for the initial texture that we'll want to go ahead and apply. So to go ahead and do that, let's go ahead and add a new argument, and we're just going to do asset key. And then what we'll do is let's do a find and replace, and we're just going to go ahead and replace our instances of this, our private asset key, with asset key. All right, then what should happen is our scene should refresh, and it looks like our container is no longer being rendered. And what's happening is we'll need to go ahead and go to our code where we create our 9-slice container, and we'll need to go ahead and pass in our asset. So let's go ahead and do our UI asset keys, and we'll go ahead and do our menu background. Likewise, let's do that to our info container as well. So we'll go ahead and pass that in. And we'll go ahead and save, and we'll see now we have our nicest container images now appearing properly. All right, so now that we have that logic working, the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and add in our method for updating our texture that's on our 9-slice image game objects. And so to go ahead and do this, what we'll need to do is for our method, we're going to need to take in our container that has our 9 image game objects. We'll need our asset key, and then we'll need our phaser 3 texture manager. And so kind of like what we did initially when we created our initial textures is with our texture manager, we'll need to take that asset key and try to retrieve it from our cache. And if it's not found, we'll go ahead and return early. And if it is found, then what we need to do is for each of our image game objects, we'll need to go ahead and update the texture that's applied to each of those. And so what we'll do is let's come to the bottom of our class and let's go ahead and create our new method. And we'll go ahead and call this update 9-slice container texture. And so inside our method for our arguments, what we'll need is we'll need our texture manager, so our phaser 3 texture manager. We're going to need our container that has our image game objects, and then finally our asset key. And so what we're going to do is let's come up to where we create our initial textures, and let's copy some of our code here. And so let's go ahead and copy these lines of code here. We'll come down here, we'll paste them. Let's come back up here. We're going to grab one more set of code, and let's do this code here. All right, so first, let's go ahead and update our method name. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to attempt to get our texture from our cache. If it's not found, we'll return early. Then what we'll want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we have more than just the base frame. So what we did initially was if our frame name's length wasn't 0, then we knew we already had additional frames created, so we didn't have to do our logic. Instead, what we want to do here is we want to check to see if it is set to 0. And if it is set to 0, that means we never initially provided this asset, and we never created our additional frames. And so without our additional frames, we won't be able to do our 9-slice scaling properly. And so instead, what we want to do is we just want to return early. And for this case, that means we didn't pass that asset name to our 9-slice class instance when we created it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change this to our warning, and let's go ahead and update our message. And we're going to go ahead and change this to the provided texture asset key does not have the required 9-slice frames. And so just as a reminder, in our original method, what we ended up doing was from our original texture, we added a bunch of new frames to it. And those frames are using these keys here. And so initially there's just a base frame, and then after our code runs, we're going to have these 9 additional frames. And we'll need those in order to go ahead and properly create the textures for our image game objects. All right, and so then if we reach this point here, we're in our happy flow. And so what we can do now is on our container, we can use the each method to go ahead and grab all of our child game objects. And then in our each, this will be our callback where we'll receive our game object, that is the child. And with our game object, what we can do now is go ahead and update our texture. And so what we'll do is just make a new variable, we'll do const, and we'll do phaser image game object. And we're going to set that equal to our game object. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add in our type. And so we'll do type, and we'll do phaser game objects image. And so what we're doing here is when we get our child game objects, the type definition for phaser is our container can take any type of game object. And so for us to know exactly what the type is, we have to explicitly tell it in our code. And so that's what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, this game object is of the type image game object. And then that way we'll have access to our methods that exist only on that type of game object. For example, like set texture. And so then what we need to do is we'll do phaser image game object. We need to call set texture. And when we call set texture, we'll provide the asset key that was provided to our method. And then we need to go ahead and provide our frame. And so we're going to set this to 0 for the time being. All right, and so we'll come back to our frame in a bit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to work on updating our options scene to actually use our new method just to see if everything's working properly. And so let's jump over to our options scene. And what we'll want to do is down in our update menu color display text method, we're going to go ahead and replace our to-dos. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to go ahead and reference our 9-slice containers. And so we'll do this, our 9-slice main container. And we're going to call the update 9-slice container texture method. And we'll go ahead and pass in this, our systems, and then our textures to get our texture manager. We'll do this. We're going to pass in our main container. So this will be our main container here that we'll be updating. And now we need to go ahead and provide our asset that we want to go ahead and use. And so this is going to be your asset keys, and this will be our main background. Then what we'll want to do is we're also going to call this for our info container. The rest of our properties will stay the same. And let's go ahead and copy these 2 lines of code, and we'll place our other to-dos. And so for our to-dos, we want to change our texture that we're using. And so for when we choose 2, we'll go ahead and do green. And when we do 3, we'll do purple. And then what we'll want to do is we need to come up to the top of our class where we create an instance of our 9-slice container, and we need to provide those assets. So let's go ahead and copy this in our asset keys. We're going to go ahead and change this to green, and then let's go ahead and pass in purple when we create our instance of our 9-slice class. All right, so we save, we'll see we have an error. And so what's happening is when we return our container from our create 9-slice container method here, we're returning it with our 9 image game objects. But however, in our options scene, we're also adding additional objects into that container. And so what we need to do is we just need to add a safety check inside our loop here, where if it's not an image game object for the time being, we'll go ahead and skip it. So what we'll do is we're just going to come down here, we'll do if, and so what we'll do is we'll do our phaser image game object, and we'll reference type, and if it doesn't equal image, we will go ahead and just return. And then we'll go ahead and save. And we'll see right away our container is now there on our screen. However, it looks really wonky. But if we do cycle through our different options, our color does update. And so what's happening is when we call set texture here, we're providing frame 0 for all of our 9 image game objects. And that's why we get this weird effect here. So those frames are being scaled based on just that first frame, so our top left. And so what we need to do is we need a mechanism to know for each of our game objects which frame of our texture should be applied. All right, so to go ahead and do this, what we're going to do is we're going to use some of the built-in methods into Phaser. And so on our game objects, Phaser has a mechanism for us to store and retrieve data from the game object's data manager. And basically what this data manager is, it's just a key value store where you can store data and reference it later from your game object. And then that way you have to manage this externally and map it to your game object. So you store there right there on your object for you to access. And so to see an example of this, let's go ahead and come up to our create 9-slice container method. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab our top left image game object, and we're going to call the set data method on this game object. And so what the set data method allows you to do is you can provide a key value pair, so a key or string that we want to store data in, and then the value is what we want to store. You can also go ahead and provide an object with multiple key value pairs, but for now we'll just be doing a string. So as an example, I'm going to go ahead and call this asset cut frame. So now with this key, I can go ahead and provide the data that I want to store. And so for our use case, what we need to really know is the name of the frame that's tied to this image game object. Then that way, when we grab that frame from our texture, we can go ahead and apply it. And so what we're going to do is just going to copy this, we're going to paste it here, and then that way we store a reference to it. And so now this is going to store our data on our game object level. And what we can do is now grab that value when we're setting our texture. So what we'll do is we'll come back down to our method and let's replace our 0. And what we'll do is we're going to do our phaser image game object. We're going to call get data. And so then what we need to do is with the get data method, you provide that key that you initially used when you set your data, and phaser will return your data for you. And so we'll do asset cut frame. And then what I'm going to do is, because we're going to reference this in multiple spots in all of our game objects, we're just going to go ahead and make a variable for this real quick. And so we're just going to do const, and we'll do asset cut frame data manager name, and we'll set that equal to our asset cut frame. And then let's come back down to our method, and let's just go ahead and change our reference. And we'll also do that up here as well. And that would just reference that same string. And so what we can do then is what phaser is going to do is it's going to attempt to find that data on our image game object. And if it does, it'll use that to set our frame. If it doesn't find it, it's going to fall back to the first frame, which is our top left frame. And so what it looks like nothing actually happened. But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to do a console log. And let's go ahead and just grab this here. And I'm just going to make a new variable. I'm going to do const frame name will be equal to that. And let's go ahead and log that out. So now we'll see right away when we log out our data, we can see our TL variable is our TL value is being logged for our one game object that we added this to. And then for the rest of our image game objects where we've not set it, it's coming back undefined. And so we can see that our data is actually working. And so what we're going to do real quick, let's get rid of our console log. We're just going to add a safety check. And we're going to say if our frame name is equal to undefined, we'll go ahead and return early. And so the reason we're doing that is similar to like what we did here where we restrict our game object type. We're also going to make sure that we actually have our frame name. And then that way, if we add other image game objects to our container, we'll go ahead and not modify those. We'll only modify the ones we've added this special property to. So then what we should be able to do is if we come back up to our code, let's go ahead and set this for all of our other image game objects. So I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to go ahead and paste it a few times beneath each of our game objects, and we'll come back and update once we do that. And we'll come here. I'm just going to add some spacing between each, just a little bit easier to read. All right, so if we come back up here, we'll go ahead and change this to TM. This will be TM, TR, TR. Let's do this for each one. All right, then after we do that, we should be able to go ahead and test our changes. So let's go ahead and come over to our scene and let's go to our menu color property. And now as we cycle through our various settings, we can see our menu actually changes our color. And so just to recap, what we're doing is basically in our new method, we're providing the asset key that we want to change. And so for our option 2 as an example, we're saying we want to use our menu background color green. And what we're going to do then is on our container that has our 9 image game objects that makes up our whole image here, we're going to go ahead and loop through our container and grab those 9 individual pieces. And then we're going to go ahead and update our texture to go ahead and be the texture frame name of that piece. So like top left, top middle, top right. And so to go ahead and do that, because we need that reference, we just stored that data on our image game objects and we went ahead and retrieved it at this point. All right, and so we have one more thing we need to do, and we need to jump over to our title scene. And so what we need to do is our title scene was where we initially created our first 9-slice instance. And so we need to go ahead and update this to use our new values for configuration. So we're going to go ahead and change this to asset keys. We'll wrap this in an array. And then we need to go ahead and come down to where we create our 9-slice container instance. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and pass in our UI asset keys and our menu background. All right, with that, what we're going to do next is we're going to switch over to updating some of our types. And so with our new method, we're going to go ahead and add in our JS.comments. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paste over our comments. And so for our update 9-slice container texture method, We're going to expect our texture manager, which will be of a type phaser textures texture manager. We'll need our container, so our phaser through game objects container. And then we'll need our asset key, which is just our string, and we return nothing. Likewise, what we need to do is up in our create 9slice container method, we need to go ahead and add in our asset key that we expect as an argument. And so what we'll do is we're just going to change this and we'll add an asset key. With that actually brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to work on enhancing our options scene to allow us to save our settings to our browser, and then that way when we refresh our game, our settings will be stored, and then from there we can use that data to go ahead and pass that to our battle scene. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of this video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in this series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.